Hello, welcome to another episode of Sermon Braindump. My name is Scott Dalen, an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa. I present these videos weekly for two reasons. One, to help break my brain out of percolation mode, as I call it, into sermonation mode as I prepare the sermon that I will preach to my congregation on Sunday. And secondly, to allow you, the viewer, who have found this video for whatever reason, to gain just different insight into the gospel lesson as presented. If you're a longtime listener, you probably think I sound a little funny. Of course, summer cold has caught me right on the verge of vacation. Always lovely, so I can do my best Barry White impression. Yeah, baby. But anywho, our gospel lesson for this Sunday, which is August 26, 2015, the ninth Sunday after Pentecost, I think. I'm blanking. I was right. The ninth Sunday after Pentecost comes from John chapter 6, verses 1 through 21. A little bit of background. Last week, we listened to Mark's account of this. Well, we kind of listened to Mark's account of the same story, and I hinted at it, but it skipped over due to a break in the gospel lesson, the feeding of the 5,000 and then Jesus walking on water. This week we actually have that story, but it's out of John's account, and this begins the first of 5 weeks in John chapter 6, which is the feeding of the 5,000, and then the discourse that kind of comes from it. Jesus happens to say, "I am the bread of life." Shortly after this, that will actually be in next week's gospel, but this begins the first of a series of John. Now, as I mentioned, I'm going to be on vacation, actually the next 2 weeks, so there will not be any videos for next week or the week after. I will be back and then following that, but just an FYI that if you happen to follow me, I'm going to be on break for a couple of weeks. That all being said, John 6, 1 through 21. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also known as the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Interesting side note, here in John's gospel, they're not called miracles, they're called signs. When it is a miracle, that for lack of a better word, but John always calls them signs. And we see later on in the towards the end of John's gospel that these signs have been written down so that you, the reader, may hear and come to believe. That's kind of why they're in there. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming towards him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they among so many people?" Okay, I'm going to take a quick break there. So we see, because of Jesus' ministry, because of the works that he is doing, the miracles that he's performing, the teaching that he's doing, he's attracting large crowds. And we've been seeing that for several weeks now. And so they're following him around, hoping that for whatever reason, we don't know the motivation of the people. They've seen what he can do, so they continue to follow him. Same situation here. He's up in a mountain with his disciples. We hear from Mark's account that he's trying to get a little break, or at least the disciples need a break because they've just been on the 2x2 gospel mission. But the crowds follow them, and Jesus, of course, has compassion on the people and meets their needs. And here we see that it's a physical need that they have. Now, what's cool about this particular miracle, this is the only miracle that's present in all 4 gospels. Different ones are presented in different gospels, sometimes 3, sometimes 2, sometimes a single one. This one, the feeding of the 5,000, is present in all 4. Makes it important. But there's some differences, as per usual, especially when John comes into account. And that is that, in particular, that we see here, Jesus knows what he's going to do. In the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we hear that the disciples ask him, "What are we to do? Should we send them away so that they can buy food? What do we do?" And Jesus just says, "Well, you feed them." Here he says, he's almost, I wonder, it says that he's testing Philip. I almost wonder if it's kind of a joke. Well, what should we do? What do you plan to do? But Jesus already has in his mind what he's going to do. And we get a sense of the crowd when Philip says, well, 200 denarii, and a denarii is a day's wage, so like 2/3 of a year or close to it, would not buy enough for everyone just to get a taste. But Jesus is like, dude, chill, just chill. Then Andrew the bringer, as we hear him called particularly in John, brings this boy who's got 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. Well, now barley, just an FYI, is kind of like secondary or secondary to wheat bread. It works, but it's not ideal. It's not what the people want, and yet it's 5 loaves and it's 2 fish. That's enough for a sandwich, and that's about it. But what is that among so many? But Jesus knows what he's going to do. Jesus said, make the people sit down in the place. So they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, and so also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost. So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that they had done, they began to say, this indeed is the prophet who is to come into the world. Okay, so Jesus has the people sit down, or tells the disciples, have the people sit down. Excuse me, I need to wipe my nose here. Again, summer cold. My apologies. So he has them sit down. Funny little side note that John gives us, there was a lot of grass in that place. We don't know why that's there. I always tend to joke around that, there's a little bit of grass in the 1970s definition. Puff, puff. Maybe that's why everyone was hungry. I won't say that from the pulpit, of course, but that's just a little thing, little side note that I always kind of key in on when I read this story. I think it's kind of funny. But so Jesus has them sit down, and he himself feeds them. That's another important difference between John and between the synoptic gospels, that there Jesus breaks the bread and he gives it to the disciples to distribute. Here it's Jesus himself that feeds them. I am the good shepherd. I lead my sheep to good pasture. Maybe that's why it says in here that there's a lot of grass. It's good pasture. I will feed them. He does so. He meets their needs in this. Now, what's interesting about the whole gather up the fragments, within the Greek, there's an important distinction. It says gather up the leftover from the abundance, and we hear that abundance a couple of times. That not only does Jesus provide, but God provides abundantly and beyond measure, beyond what we could hope for. Now, the whole so that's an important side note. And then there's another thought here right at the end of what I read before about the people see this and they say, well, here's the prophet that's to come into the world. They've been talking about Moses in chapter 5 just before this, and then following this, when we get into the discourse, the I'm the bread of life discourse, there's a lot of talk about Moses. When Moses was leading the people, God provided the manna, and so this is kind of a juxtaposition of that important comparison, that Jesus is not only like Moses, but he surpasses. And of course he does, because he's God. And that is keyed out in what we're going to get to now, the second part of this story, as we see that Jesus walks on the water. All of chapter 6 has to do with the feeding of the 5,000 and then Jesus teaching about it, and Jesus talking about it, which raises the question, why is this tiny little side note section of just a few verses in here? And I'll read that now. When evening came, hold on, I need to back up. When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, because he wasn't ready for that, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself, so he pulls away by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea and got into a boat and started to cross the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. But he said to them, it is I, do not be afraid. Side note, Greek, ego eimi, I am, is what that is. Literally, I am God. I am God. Every time in John we hear I am, Jesus is saying, I'm God. Okay? Take note of that. Then they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land towards where they were going. Okay, so that's the second part of the gospel. And as I mentioned, from here, then we flip back into ongoing conversation about what has happened in the feeding of the 5,000. And so why is this side note here? It's the story of Jesus walking on the water. It does not include the portion when Peter also walks on the water. That's only found in Matthew. And that's an important aspect of this story. But for here, it's that Jesus is not going to let a little thing like physics stop him. He's going to walk on the water when he needs to go and meet the needs of his disciples. Now, what we don't hear in this particular passage is that he calms the storm. We hear that in some of the other ones. We don't hear that here. We only hear that the storm is going on. And because of the storm, the disciples are having trouble rowing the boat. They're not getting where they need to go. So Jesus comes and he helps them get where they need to go. And why? Because he's God. I am. Ego eimi. And I think that's in relation to what he had done. Why could he feed the 5,000 people abundantly with hardly any food at all? Because he's God. And why can he walk on the water? Because he's God. It's the way things go. Now, there's a side note, and I think where I'm going to go with the sermon on this one is these two miraculous situations can try and be explained away. Sometimes people will say that, okay, so the 5 loaves and 2 fish, everyone got a tiny little taste, just a tiny taste, and they were spiritually filled. I think that's bubkiss personally because of the whole like filling 12 baskets with leftovers thing. But that's one explanation. Another explanation is this is like the first Lutheran potluck, and that because the boy brought out his food, everybody else brought out what they had, and there was so much that they could that everyone ate, but it's because everyone gave of themselves. Once again, I don't like that notion. Then there's the notion that perhaps the disciples in the boat were rowing along the shoreline, and the Greek is a little ambiguous. So was Jesus walking on the water, or was Jesus walking along the shoreline, or was Jesus walking close to them and he just called out to them? Again, I think that's trying to explain away the miracle that God can do amazing things far beyond our comprehension. And that's expressed here. Those are the signs that Jesus does to show the presence of God in the world. And when we try and explain them away, when we try and justify them, which you hear that in things like this, and you hear it in other accounts or other things about trying to explain away miraculous things that happen in the Bible, it just really kind of torques me up. Now, granted, I have a science background. My undergrad degree was in science, so I've worked a lot to try and reconcile my science brain with my faith brain, and that's a whole nother video, which I won't go into here. But oftentimes we want to explain stuff away instead of just marveling in the greatness of what God has done. And what greater thing than we can ask about than God dies to bring us into relationship with him and make that relationship possible. I mean, that's mind blowing right there. That's the amazingness of the gospel. So that's kind of what's happening in this video or in this passage. Now, again, this sets up 5 more weeks in John 6. Which we'll get a part of when I'm back. If you have any questions or comments, please throw those down in the comment section. I'd love to hear from you when those show up, and we can continue the conversation that way. Otherwise, I hope you have a great week, a great couple of weeks, or 3 weeks actually, and God bless. We'll catch you next time.